Hi everyone. I'm trying to try something different today. This would be the view you would have if you were sitting at the floor for listening and learning. So today we're going to do Jamestown and the Powhatan. Yesterday we talked about the 3 ships that the English took to come to America to establish their first permanent English colony. Do you remember what those ships were? They were the Discovery, the Susan Constant, and the Godspeed. What does Godspeed mean? It means good luck. Who was the king who chartered the colony of Jamestown? I hope you said King James I. What was the investment company that got permission by King James I to establish Jamestown? It was the Virginia Company of London. Now, when we're talking about the colonies, we're going to be talking about different regions. And Jamestown is located in the southern region. The name of the river that was near Jamestown was, of course, the James River in honor of the king. The Native American tribe that lived near there were the Powhatan. And when Captain Newport returned to England for supplies, who helped take over in the leadership? And you can see him in this picture right here, Captain John Smith. So today I want you to listen to see what happens at Jamestown Colony. John Smith talking to the colonists. Captain John Smith was hardworking and organized. Many historians believe that without him, Jamestown would not have survived. When John Smith finally took charge of the settlement, he did not beat around the bush. And we have our little thing up here. Oh, let me take it up. Do you see our little picture? Beat around the bush. So we do have that. But he didn't like to beat around the bush. So he introduced a very strict and direct rule. Only those who worked would eat. As you can imagine, Captain Smith was not very popular with everyone, especially the wealthy young adventurers who had never worked a day in their lives. John Smith knew it would be a huge challenge for the settlers to survive the cold winter months. As the weeks went by, Smith urged everyone to work on construction of Jamestown, to gather fruits and berries, to fish and hunt, and to use sparingly or very carefully the little food that they had stored. There were several different accounts of what happened during this time. One well-known version of the story, which you may have heard, tells that how the cold winter months came, many of his fellow settlers were sick and starving to death. John Smith set off to hunt and to persuade the Powhatan to give them food. According to this account, which some might call a legend, Smith was captured by the Powhatan warriors and taken to their chief because they wanted to kill the man who was leading the foreigners. Then, as the story goes, just moments away from Smith's death, the chief's young daughter, Pocahontas, or Matoaka, begged her father to spare Smith. The chief agreed to his daughter's request, and Smith was released. Many historians today believe that this may be a romanticized version of what happened. They believe that the Powhatan did not actually intend to kill Smith. Instead, he wanted to adopt Smith into the Powhatan tribe. The ritual in which many Native American cultures used involved the figurative killing of a person's identity in order to be reborn into their new identity. So historians believe that the Powhatan were going to figuratively kill John Smith's English identity so he could become a Powhatan. When Smith returned to the Jamestown colony, the colonists had abandoned their work schedule. They were squabbling or arguing among themselves. Snow was on the ground, their food supply was low. Some were even spending their time foolishly searching for gold. Smith was not pleased. he immediately set to work hunting and fishing and doing what he could to persuade his cold, hungry, disheartened companions that all was not lost. Then one day a small band of Powhatan, led by Pocahontas, appeared out of the forest. Having taken pity on this bunch of disorganized foreigners, the Powhatan brought with them much needed food. Pocahontas and the members of the Powhatan tribe returned many times with food and general aid or help. They also taught the English new hunting and farming techniques. The food the Powhatan provided was enough to keep the English alive until help from their homeland arrived. That help did come in January of 1608 when Captain Newport's ship, the Susan Constant, arrived laden or full of food and more than 100 new settlers. Needless to say, the Powhatan were not happy to see even more strangers coming to live on the land where they inhabited. For a while, the situation for Smith and his men improved. With more food to eat, they had energy to work. With more men, they had more hands to help construct the much-needed homes. Then tragedy struck. Somehow, and it's not certain how, a fire broke out. The fierce flames quickly devoured or destroyed many of the buildings, as well as some of the food supply and clothes. You can imagine how devastating or upsetting this was for the settlers. The English had no choice but to start again. Fortunately, by this time, the weather was getting warmer. The Powhatan had taught them how to grow corn, which they called maize, now that the weather was better. The Native Americans helped them once again by supplying them with more food. Under John Smith's supervision, the men set to work rebuilding their homes, planting corn, and learning how to live in the new land. When spring came, Captain Newport set sail for England. Some historians have written that colonists who had been wasting their time searching for gold persuaded Captain Newport to load his ship with a large amount of red-colored dirt and bring it with him. The gold-hungry colonists were certain that tiny pieces of gold would be found once the dirt was properly examined in England. However, no gold was found. It seems that Captain Newport transported nothing more than a shipload of dirt across the Atlantic Ocean. Captain Newport returned to Jamestown again in the fall. The English colonists were happy to see him again. This time, Newport brought more supplies as well as 70 men and 2 women. Finally, 2 women. One woman, Mrs. Thomas Forrest, was a wife of one of the men on board. The other was her maid, Anne Burris. They were the first 2 women to live in Jamestown. Some of the other new settlers were from Poland and Germany, and they brought the skill of glass-making to the colony. By this time, John Smith had been elected president of the colony, and he had consistently enforced his rule: all must work if they wanted to eat. In fact, these are Captain John Smith's exact words. He that gathereth not every day as much as I do, the next day shall be sent beyond the river and be banished from the fort as a drone till he amend his conditions or starve. Under John Smith's leadership, the colony began to prosper. Smith continued to establish fairly good relations with the Powhatan Indians. The 2 communities even began to trade with each other. The settlers traded beads and copper for food. However, 2 years after Jamestown was established, John Smith was injured in a gunpowder explosion. Without medical assistance, his wounds would not heal. Smith was forced to return to England. The man chosen to lead the colony in his absence was George Percy. Unfortunately, Percy was not as good of a leader as Smith had been. However, to be fair, he did have challenge on his hands the moment he arrived. After Smith left, the Powhatans seemed to have a change of heart with regard to their new neighbors. Without John Smith there to actively promote friendship and trade between the Native Americans, between Native Americans and the colonists, relations began to suffer. The Powhatan no longer had someone they felt they could trust within the colony, and they became wary of the colonists. They began to raid Jamestown and steal essential supplies, especially food. They fought with the settlers, killing some of them. In addition, the English settlers, without John Smith there to enforce his rules, did not manage their food supplies as carefully as they should have. Then, once again, part of the settlement caught fire. This time, the Powhatan refused to help the English settlers. The settlers waited anxiously for a ship that was due to arrive with supplies, but no ship appeared. The winter of 1609 to 1610 became known as the starving time because the colonists ran out of food and many of them died. Finally, one spring day, 2 ships were spotted. They were the Patience and the Deliverance. The settlers who had survived ran to the banks of the James River in eager anticipation. Both ships, though, had been badly damaged at sea and had just barely made it to Virginia. They were low on supplies. The settlers begged to be taken back to England, and the 2 captains agreed. Perhaps the most incredible part of this story is what happened next. Just as the surviving settlers had turned their backs on Jamestown and set sail for England, they spotted an advance party of Englishmen sailing toward them. The retreating settlers were immediately informed that Lord Delaware was close behind. Lord Delaware was appointed by King James to serve as governor or leader of Jamestown. Lord Delaware, it seems, had saved the day. Well, the entire settlement, actually. He had led 3 ships across the Atlantic filled to the brim with Englishmen and supplies, destined for Jamestown. The Powhatan must have been horrified to see the settlers return. Even worse, there were more of them. Fortunately for the settlers, Lord Delaware turned out to be a good leader. He restored a sense of order in Jamestown. Under his leadership, the buildings were repaired and the food and supplies were efficiently managed. However, Lord Delaware did not reach out to the Powhatan as John Smith had. Things in England were changing, and instructions to Jamestown from the Virginia Company of London were to stop trading with and relying upon the nearby Native Americans. Over the next several years, more and more skilled settlers made their way to Virginia. Eventually, in 1619, the first shipload of women arrived. Colonists began to raise family in the English colony. Although gold was not discovered, something just as valuable was. In time, a settler named John Rolfe began to establish relationship with the Powhatan again. Guided by the Powhatan and under supervision of John Rolfe, the settlers began to grow tobacco. There were other important developments that took place in 1619. Now that things were going quite well in the English colonies, the English government felt comfortable allowing the colonists to make certain rules for themselves. This was, as long as the colonists remembered who was really in charge. On July 30th, 1619, the first lawmaking assembly gathered in the Virginia House of Burgesses. Members of the House of Burgesses were chosen to represent areas of the colony of Virginia. Of course, only men could be chosen, but the House of Burgesses would eventually pave the way for self-government and eventually independence. It was during another period of conflict between the Powhatan and the settlers that the Powhatan kidnapped some of the settlers and took several firearms or guns. In response, the settlers kidnapped Pocahontas. Pocahontas's father was willing to return the kidnapped settlers in exchange for his daughter, but not the firearms or guns. In response, the settlers refused to let Pocahontas go. Consequently, or as a result, Pocahontas spent quite a bit of time in the English settlement, several years in fact. During this time, she and John Rolfe were married and had a son named Thomas. During this time, Pocahontas converted to Christianity and took the name Rebecca. She and John Rolfe traveled together to England, where they were guests at the court of King James. Sadly, just as Pocahontas and John Rolfe were preparing to return to Virginia, Pocahontas became very ill. She died on March 21, 1617, at the age of 22, and was buried in England. Later in the last years of his life, John Smith spoke of Pocahontas and said that without her help and the help of the Powhatan, Jamestown would never have survived. Perhaps this colony was given the wrong name. What do you think? Thanks for listening, guys. Bye.